Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first event of the Global Tipping Points Spring Series for the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. My name is Tim Horgan, and I am the Executive Director of the Council. And whether you are watching live or the recording, we welcome you and thank you for your interest. Before we kick off tonight's meeting, we have a few things to get through. First and foremost, I want to thank our wonderful partners for helping us to spread the word about this program and our upcoming events in this series. Thank you to the Business and Industry Association of New Hampshire, the Small Business Development Center, the Greater Manchester Chamber of Commerce, the New Hampshire Business Review, and the New Hampshire Tech Alliance. In addition, I'd like to thank our mission partner, Southern New Hampshire University, for all of their ongoing support that they provide to help us continue to bring these amazing programs to you, our audience. As I'm handing out the thank yous, I would also like to thank our wonderful members and donors who ensure the sustainability of the Council. Your generous support is vital to our ongoing success, and we are honored that you find value in our programs. If you have not yet had the chance to become a member, we humbly ask that you consider joining our growing global community. We have been increasing in strength in the past several years and would love to have you as a member. You can sign up online at wacnh.org or by talking with our membership manager, Larry McCrum. I also must mention that the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and therefore we do not take any stances on policies, issues, candidates, or political parties. We are here as a platform for discussion, and we hope that you will take the information you hear tonight and formulate your own opinions and conclusions. For this reason, the views expressed in tonight's program are those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect those of the organization's staff, board, members, donors, sponsors, or partners. All right, enough about me. Let's get on to tonight's speaker. We are so excited to have Bob Troublecock joining us for this conversation. When I came across an article that he wrote talking about landing at Manchester Boston Regional Airport, I knew we had a local who could effectively communicate the challenges we are seeing in the global supply chain today. Bob is the editorial director of Supply Chain Management Review and the executive editor of Modern Materials Handling. Known as the Harvard Business Review for Supply Chain Managers, SCMR is a professional journal covering the end-to-end supply chain for supply chain managers. MMH is the oldest and largest circulation publication covering the movement of goods and the movement of information about those goods inside the four walls of the distribution center and factory. Trebilcock grew up in the supply chain industry. His family has been in the industrial packaging business for more than 60 years, and he has been a magazine writer and editor for nearly 40. He has been the recipient of numerous national magazine awards as a writer and an editor, and he and his wife have lived in Keene, New Hampshire since 1984. Thanks so much for joining us, Bob.
Thank you, Tim. Good evening, and thanks for having me. Now, I'll give everybody a warning first. Since I am a writer by trade, I tend to work from notes. So I'm going to be reading. If you see me looking down, I'm not being rude. I'm not checking my phone. It's just the way I can stay on track. And that was a great introduction, Tim. And I do like to say that I did grow up in the supply chain industry when most people's parents were taking them to Disney World. My dad was taking me to the Borg Warner Auto Parts plant in Buffalo, New York. I grew up seeing the Midwest. I grew up in Ohio, seeing the Midwest from the back end of a factory in places like Steubenville, West Virginia, and Fort Wayne, Indiana, and so on. So it's been kind of in my blood. So what are we going to talk about tonight? As all of you know, supply chain has been in the news, and a lot. And it's not for the reasons we'd like to be in the news. Just this afternoon, as I was working on these notes, the New York Times published an article online with the headline, "A Normal Supply Chain? Well, it's unlikely in 2022. Now, I don't disagree. But what I'm here to share with you are 2 points. First, none of the issues highlighted in that article, port congestion, labor shortages, and supply shortages, are new to supply chain managers. They've been dealing with them for years. What's been different the last 2 years was layering a global pandemic and all that that entailed on top of an already difficult situation. The second is, while I do agree that things aren't going to be back to whatever was normal at the end of 2022, there are already signs of improvement. Manufacturing activity is back to pre-pandemic levels, according to the Institute for Supply Management. At the same time, the Wall Street Journal published an article this week about steel prices dropping. So why? Why is that happening? Because steel makers are working through the backlog of orders that they've had, and the demand for new steel is dropping to more usual levels now that we're all done replacing our refrigerators. Another data point. While 2021 was supposed to be the year that supply chain ruined Christmas, we weren't even going to get a lump of coal in our stockings because there were no lumps of coal to be found. The shelves were actually stocked. Companies like American Eagle reported 97% on-time delivery of online orders. And this was during a Christmas when retail sales were up 18%. Supply chains actually did very well during Christmas and even the Thanksgiving holiday. It's a seriously weird time in supply chain. One of my writers has dubbed it the decade of digitalization. I always have trouble with that word. Digitalization and disruption. So what does that mean? Supply chains have made huge leaps forward over the last decade in automation. That's the digital part. At the same time, for the last 2 years, we sometimes seem to be stuck in the mud dealing with one disruption after another. We thought we were coming out of the pandemic. You had the Suez Canal that just screwed up global shipping. You had bad weather in Texas that shut down, chip plants. It's been sort of one thing after another. In the next 15 minutes, I'm going to give you a high-level overview of what's happening in the supply chain right now. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of depth in this beginning because it's really easy to get into the weeds, and that's just going to send all of you screaming for the mute button. But after that, when I'm done and Tim starts to look for your questions or has some of his own, I'm happy to answer any questions and at whatever depth that you would like. Last, bear in mind, my views are shaped by the senior level supply chain leaders I talk to every day from Fortune 500 companies. What they've got to say today is probably different from what you're reading in the paper or hearing on TV because they're looking forward, not backward. But it really is a report from the ground. So here goes. I thought a good starting point was let's have a common understanding. Just what is supply chain? And there is a definition. Supply chain management is usually defined by something called the SCORE model. And it's all of the activities it takes to plan production, source the materials needed to manufacture a product, the manufacturing product process itself, the transportation, storage, and final delivery of finished goods. That's the stuff you and I buy, followed by the return of those goods for whatever reason. Every one of those processes was impacted during the pandemic, every single one. So what's going on here? In the summer of 2020, I had a conversation with the chief supply chain officer of the largest distributor of medical supplies in the country. His company also happens to be the largest importer of product from China. So he has a real global view. He said to me, the short version of what he said to me was, we're not dealing with anything that we weren't dealing with before. COVID just made all those things worse. Then he gave me a blow by blow of everything that was going wrong from manufacturing China all the way to UPS picking up his packages, in his distribution center. If we have time later, I'll be happy to walk you through it if Tim asks. The New York Times hit on international shipping woes, but most companies with global supply chains have been wrestling with shipping woes since the tariff and trade wars that got underway in 2016. And even going beyond that, port congestion in Long Beach is nothing new. Sure, there's a labor shortage. We're hearing a lot about that. But the first conference on the labor shortage in warehousing was held 17 years ago in 2005. I gave my first presentation on that topic at a national conference in 2015. I was on a panel talking about the truck driver shortage in 2017. Again, in truth, most warehouses have been experiencing 100% annual turnover in labor for years. In some places, it's worse. I got to know one of the plant managers at the Honda plant in Marysville, Ohio. This is like 6-7 years ago. And he told me the goal that Honda gave him for turnover in the materials handling part of his plant was to limit it to 20% a month, not 20% a year, but to limit turnover to 20% a month. And he said they rarely hit that goal. Most trucking companies have been experiencing 100% plus turnover among truck drivers for years. Now think of this. The average age of a truck driver is in the mid-50s. If that's the average, you know that there are a whole lot of truck drivers behind the wheel in their 60s and older, and just biology is destiny. They're not going to be around all that much longer. At the same time, young people have not wanted to go into truck driving. There's a reason for that. The fact is, supply chain jobs at the floor level, to be honest, are terrible jobs. And again, if Tim asks, I'll walk you through what's involved in being a typical warehouse worker. Until recently, they were not only very hard work, they were really low paid. As an example, I was at a conference and I had a guy on a panel from Louisiana, and he said to me, Amazon has just destroyed my warehouse. I had to raise my pay 25% and I still can't get workers. And I said, well, what are you paying them now? And he said, $12.50. I used to pay $10 an hour. So think about that. You're asking, grown adults, because you can't be a high school kid, flipping burgers at McDonald's, to work 40 hours a week for $400, and you're wondering why there's turnover. It's gotten better recently. It's not just at the floor level. For a number of years, the big high-tech firms, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, and the like, have been harvesting the best engineering and software talent for years. And the supply chain runs on engineering and software. So the result of that is that the ranks of engineers and technical staff at most major manufacturing companies is comprised of either individuals in their 50s and 60s with lots of experience, but they're getting close to retirement, or new hires in their 20s without a lot of experience. Technical staff in their 30s and 40s with 10 to 15 years of experience has just been hollowed out. And one of the reasons is that parents, my parents, I'm in my 60s, but lots of parents for years were saying to their kids, you don't want to go into industry. You don't want to go into manufacturing. You don't want to go into logistics. Go into these other fields. There's a lot more money. They're more promising. As one manufacturing executive said to me, we lost a whole generation. We were just hollowed out. There are things afoot to try and change that, but it's been a problem for years. So what happened with supply chains? They actually performed as designed. At MIT, there's a professor named Yossi Sheffi. Now, Yossi is one of the best known supply chain researchers in the world. He's also kind of a poke you in the eye with a sharp stick kind of a guy who likes to be a little bit controversial. Yossi argues that supply chains didn't fail at all in the spring of 2020. They performed exactly as they were designed to perform. He even wrote a book to prove his point at that time that got a lot of attention. So what did he mean? Supply chains were designed to operate with minimal inventory on warehouse and store shelves because our transportation and delivery systems operated like clockwork for years. You really could have things manufactured 8,000 miles away in China or 3,000 miles away in Mexico and get them delivered to a factory or a store on a just-in-time basis because industry had spent 30 years perfecting those systems. So let me give you a real-life example. Right before COVID, I had an opportunity to visit an Amazon fulfillment center in New Haven. That fulfillment center stocked 1 million SKUs. If you don't know what an SKU is, that's the number that identifies an individual product. So they had in that facility 1 million different products for delivery from that location. They only kept 3 million items in stock at any one time, which means there were a lot of those SKUs that they only had one of in the building. Yet they had their replenishment processes down to such a science that they were rarely out of stock, even of the things that they only kept one in item. You can't imagine how amazing that is. Those systems anticipated disruptions. Supply chain managers have playbooks for just about every hiccup you can imagine. The Gap once had its brand new primary e-fulfillment center in New York burned down in August, 3 months before the start of the holiday season. They had a playbook for that. They were able to move all of their fulfillment for the holidays to a campus in Gallatin, Tennessee. They never missed a beat. Firefighting is a fact of life for supply chain managers. But none of those playbooks anticipated an event that would shut down industry on a global basis in a matter of just weeks. Just as importantly, which goes to a lot of what's happened last summer and this fall, no one anticipated or planned for the huge spike in demand that started last spring when we thought we were coming out of this. And cranking up a global supply chain is a little like turning around the proverbial battleship. Here's a real world example. Southern Glazers is the world's largest distributor of wine and spirits. During 1 week in March, half their business, those were shipments of liquor and wine to bars, restaurants, hotels, cruise ships, stadiums, that shut down, while their sales to retail stores went through the roof as we all drank at home and probably more than we should have. Well, guess what? Those two markets utilize different size bottles. So they couldn't just substitute the bottles that they had to go to restaurants and bars for what they needed to ship to, the New Hampshire liquor store. So all of a sudden there's this kind of shortage that they couldn't easily replenish. So now we start to come out of this and they're saying to themselves, well, are people going to keep drinking at home? Are they going to go back to bars and restaurants? Are they going to do both? What size bottles do we need to stock and in what quantity? That question was repeated over and over and over again, and apparently not always successfully, at like every business you can imagine. So, or another, remember that I said warehouses were already struggling to get enough workers to staff a shift. Now, e-commerce is incredibly labor intensive because you're picking things one item at a time rather than taking a forklift that picks up a pallet that has 10,000 items in cartons and then put it on a truck. When COVID hit, Jo-Ann Fabrics, we've all seen at the Strip Plaza, Jo-Ann Fabrics had to shut down 50% of its stores in 1 day. And they had all kinds of employees at the stores and their distribution centers out sick or, afraid to come to work because of COVID. Yet their daily e-commerce orders were 10 times their Cyber Monday order, which historically is the busiest day of the year. That 10 times went on for 3 months. When I talked to the supply chain manager at Jo-Ann Fabrics in like August of the summer of 2020, he said they were no longer at 10x, but they were at 3x. So remember, we already had labor shortages. We have further labor shortages because of COVID and sickness and people out. We have the most labor intensive process in the supply chain now ramps up to a 10 times factor. Everything just broke down. So how do we get out of this? How do we look beyond COVID? Supply chain managers, for the most part, are not focused on the pandemic at this point. Their view is if their team hasn't figured out how to operate by now, they're either not long for their job or their company won't be around much longer. Instead, they look at issues today in two buckets. I call them transitory and persistent. So a transitory disruption is a hiccup. The most visible example of a transitory hiccup during the first pandemic was the toilet paper shortage. Now, if you're in the John and there's no toilet paper, it's probably not very satisfying for me to tell you, well, there was a perfectly logical explanation for that shortage, but hey, it's transitory. It'll work itself out. That really was the case. And if you want to know more, ask me during the Q&A, and I can explain what happened in the toilet paper industry. A persistent disruption is one that was a major problem well before COVID, one for which there is no easy fix or short-term solution, and one that supply chain managers will probably be dealing with for years to come. And there's a long list of those, but the big three are the talent crisis. So I mentioned this earlier, it's not new. The increase in e-commerce has made it worse because it takes so much more labor to pick an e-commerce order. The only way out of that is automation. E-commerce is so labor intensive that you just can't throw more people at the problem. And if you look at what happens, for instance, with Amazon, a typical e-commerce facility employs about 500 people. When Amazon comes into your neighborhood, they build just a ginormous distribution center, and they employ 2,000 people on a regular daily basis and up to 5,000 people during the holidays. So during the holidays, Amazon is sucking up what would typically go into 10 other distribution centers. Amazon pays better than anybody. They have benefits that you wouldn't believe. They'll give away a car to entice people. So there's just not enough people to man all the distribution centers that we need to fulfill e-commerce orders. The only way out of it is automation. That's been underway since 2015, which was a year that supply chains really did crumble at the holidays. But it can take 5 years to purchase land, plan, design, build, and then go live with a new facility. So the facilities that people started going after after the 2015 holiday disaster were just coming online when COVID hit. And things that people are building now aren't going to go online for a few more years. The second one is what's called understanding true demand. And this is huge right now. We're in the midst of a huge spike in demand, right? We're all buying things like crazy. Holiday sales set records this year. That's leading to some of the issues we're experiencing right now, like the inability to get Coke Zero in an aluminum can, 12-ounce can. So supply chain managers have been ordering a lot of what's called just-in-case inventory. They need 100 widgets. They think they're only going to get 90, so they order 200. Here's their big fear. What if everyone gets back on track? What if instead of getting 90 items when they order 200, they actually get 200? And what if all that money on the sidelines finally gets spent? The fear is that we very quickly go from an inventory shortage to a big inventory surplus. That has also led them to be afraid to invest capital to expand their capacity. There aren't enough trucks, there aren't enough factories, there aren't enough warehouses. Everybody's afraid if they build that new factory to meet today's demand, by the time they get it built, we're going to be back to usual demand, and they're going to have a big factory that they just don't need. So you have a lot of industries sitting on the sidelines wondering, do we invest or do we not invest? Because they don't really understand what demand is going to be. Sustainability. Sustainability was in the doldrums as a burning issue before COVID. It's now back top of mind, and it's not just going green, it's the whole what's called ESG, which is economy, sustainability, and governance. So a lot of that falls on supply chain, since manufacturing, distribution, and transportation are responsible, for instance, for a lot of the energy consumption, packaging going into the landfill. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the S part of ESG. Top of mind of supply chain managers is diversity and inclusion right now. And this goes directly to the labor and talent shortage issue. Supply chain managers are realizing they have to look to new populations to get the talent they need in the future, or they're just not going to be able to compete. I have never seen this before with supply chain managers, and I've had 3 or 4 chief supply chain officers want to talk to me about their diversity and inclusion programs. And then perhaps last is trade wars and political instability. For the past 11 years, supply chains have been in the midst of a global redesign for a lot of reasons. The first was the Japanese tsunami of 2011. I don't know if you remember that one. But supply chain managers had been putting all of their eggs in one basket. So the trend was to choose to work with 2 and sometimes only 1 supplier of critical items and make them almost part of your company. And the belief was you'll get the better price, you'll get better service, and you'll get better access to innovation if you do that. Well, then along comes the 2011 tsunami, and it wiped out the only plants of 2 suppliers of a critical component required to make cars. And that tsunami, because there were only 2 companies in the world that made it, and they were both near one another in Japan, it shut down auto production for weeks, if not months. That started a whole sort of rethink about how are we purchasing And, what do we need to do to take risk out of our supply chain? These things happen slowly. So procurement leaders began developing alternative sources of supply and looking at different geographies. Getting closer to your customer was a second reason. Now, that's been going on for decades. It's a reason in the auto industry, Honda built a major plant in Columbus, Ohio, or Volkswagens in Tennessee and BMWs in South Carolina. But more recently, I interviewed the chief supply chain officer for Black & Decker, who said to me, excuse me, their initiative is called Make Where You Sell, Buy Where You Make, which means that rather than making everything in China or even the US, they're now setting up manufacturing shop in the regions where they do business, Eastern Europe to satisfy Western Europe, Mexico, perhaps for the US, but also for South America. And then they want to buy from suppliers near those factories. Then along come the tariffs in 2016. And that was an acceleration. That kind of pushed those strategies, further, faster. And now COVID has given another push because people, if they had everything in Wuhan, where there's a lot of manufacturing, and it got shut down, they couldn't go to, say, northern Italy, or they couldn't go to, to the US, or they couldn't go to Mexico. So they're now, rethinking in part because of COVID. You're going to hear a lot of talk about reshoring, bringing production back to the US. And a couple of points just to remember. We've been outsourcing for 40 years. We're really good at outsourcing. China and Mexico have been manufacturing for us for 40 years. They're really good at manufacturing. When we outsourced, we lost all the ecosystems that support manufacturing. That's all those suppliers that we need to assemble a product. So today, even if you manufacture in the US, a lot of your materials, parts, and components are going to come from overseas. Otherwise, it's going to take years to replace that capacity and expertise. There are moves along though, but that's going to be slow. A lot of the news you see about reshoring activity isn't necessarily US companies moving back to the US. It's what's called direct foreign investment. So when BMW expanded its production in the Southeast, or Volkswagen expands production in Tennessee, the reshoring people consider that reshoring. Last, moving production back to the US doesn't mean moving jobs back to the US, or at least not in any way that moves the needle. I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, which was autos and steel when I was a kid. No one's going to build a new steel mill that employs 4,000 people per shift the way Youngstown Sheet and Tube did when I was a kid. We've automated manufacturing and will continue to do so. We'll bring production back, but we won't necessarily bring jobs back. So that's a fast and furious overview of supply chain management today and a little bit about the disruptions. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Bob. Let's change our view there a little bit. We've had a lot of great questions come in already, and we'd love for people to continue to send us our questions about tonight's events. So going through, I think I'm going to start off with a question here from an audience member. What about the international dimension of supply chain disruption? Did tariff disputes, trade war with China and the US contribute to it? And I would add to that, we also, put tariffs on many of our allies for steel and aluminum for national security purposes. Can you just talk a little bit about how those may have impacted all this?
Yeah, I did a thing with Rider University in New Jersey. This is before, having nothing to do with the pandemic. It was pre-pandemic. And audit was like a procurement guy from Subaru, and there was somebody from a chemical company. The tariffs, there's no question but that tariffs were disrupting global supply chains before the pandemic. And that's having nothing to do with labor or any of those other things. So, in part, global manufacturers, you can't easily just go out and get another supplier. You've got to, particularly for something like, autos or aircraft or things, you've really got to put a new supplier through the ringer to qualify them. So yes, as I'd mentioned before, there was already a rethinking in the industry. They call it China plus one. So if you had a lot of your production in China, people started thinking of, well, where can I develop another supplier and develop a supplier in another region? So, the tariffs were disrupting supply chains before the pandemic, but I don't think you can blame supply chain shortages on the tariffs versus just everything shut down, if you follow what I mean.
Yeah, certainly. So we've had another question come in here, and sort of looking to the international again. Are other countries seeing the same shortages that the U.S. is? And I would add to that as well. Is this really just a U.S. problem, or is there something deeper and wider going on?
I don't think it's just a U.S. problem. However, remember that the U.S. is the biggest consumer. So, and I mean, and I'm not just talking about you and I as individual consumers at home, but U.S. manufacturing is a huge consumer as well. So, whatever's happening in other parts of the world, it's magnified for us, right? Because we buy and source so much more material than any other country. I'm hesitant to use a number because I haven't looked at it for a while. But there was a time where China was the second largest country in the world for like manufacturing output, and they were still half of what we were, and then the rest of the world was down below that. I do know that there were some companies, and I can give you a couple examples. Eaton Corp was one, and a company called Agco, which is one of the world's largest manufacturers of agricultural equipment. They got signals coming out of Wuhan as early as like December 29th, 2019, and they took them seriously. And as a result, they started moving production into other parts of the world before Wuhan shut down completely. And as a result, they didn't experience, everybody got hit with something, right? But they didn't experience the kind of shutdowns and shortages that other companies that really didn't take it seriously until March experienced. As an example, Agco they told me they bought something like $6 million worth of PPE in January of 2020 and stocked it in their warehouses, and then started shipping it to their suppliers first in China so they could keep operating. And then they took the learnings from what they learned in China to northern Italy, because remember, Italy was the next hotspot. And they were supplying like PPE and other things that were required for their suppliers to keep operating, and they kept operating. Eaton, I talked with their internal communications manager, who I'd gone to college with, and she was saying that like they started hearing about Wuhan on New Year's Eve, and they started having a war room every morning. And as COVID expanded, it was like supply chain managers from more and more countries part of the thing. But they were able to take steps to keep operating. So I think companies that took this, you couldn't escape everything, but companies that took it seriously, kept operating and figured out how to operate before some of their competitors. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Yeah, I think that does. So speaking of China, we have a question here about the role that China's investment and control of the largest ocean container shipping companies plays, as well as sort of what their role in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative plays in perhaps helping to eventually alleviate these challenges.
Yeah, so in terms of shipping, Maersk shipping is pretty global. Maersk is, I believe, the largest shipping and container company in the world. I don't follow global shipping that closely. I had an editor who just retired who was a shipping expert. So I'm, to be honest, frankly, hesitant to weigh in on that. The Belt and Road is something different. I think what's interesting about the Belt and Road is that long term, it gives China a foothold in countries because it's investing in there, and perhaps may give it access to supply and talent and things like that over other countries just because China has invested in there. The flip side is I talked with somebody from one of the African countries where China has gone in and invested a lot. And they said that the problem with it is that China comes in and invests a lot of money, but they bring over all Chinese labor and are reluctant to hire local labor. And so it sometimes leaves a bad taste in their mouth. But China is making huge investments in infrastructure, not just in China, but around the world. And then they're also making huge investments in technology, for instance, in AI and machine learning. And the advantage that they have in that area is so AI and machine learning, which are becoming a thing for supply chain management, need data. They need data to learn. And as one guy put it to me, there's 300 million Americans from which companies can start getting data, to build their AI and machine learning. There's 1.3 billion Chinese. And the Chinese are much more aggressive about getting data from their citizens because they can. So it goes, if you rely on data to learn, and you've got 300 million in the US and 1.3 billion in China, who do you think is going to win? There's another example of that kind of goes to your question in a roundabout way. I'm friendly with the chief supply chain officer for American Eagle, who told me that they ship something like 520 million packages a year, and Walmart ships like 52 billion. And so his whole point was, who's going to learn the lessons from all those packages they ship when we're shipping, 1/10 of what Walmart is shipping. They're just getting more data and hence more learning. So I think, China is building infrastructure. They're building, whether it's goodwill or ill will, they're building, relationships in those countries. And they're mostly underdeveloped countries in, South America, in Africa. And they're making huge investments in technology.
Yeah, we've certainly heard a lot from our previous speakers about the positives and negatives of the Belt and Road Initiative. And we've got a question here that sort of keys off of one of the things you talked about in access to inputs. So what about access to inputs and primary resources? Semiconductor production cannot keep up with demand and seems to have wide-ranging issues. I think they're also speaking to, just those raw materials that will allow you to create whatever you are. Are we seeing issues around that? Is that slowing production?
Yeah, well, certainly, we've all read about the chip shortage in, for automobiles. And so it's almost like the analogy is the same as when I talked about the increase in e-commerce orders. And what I mean is, a chip is now going into everything, right? It goes now into your refrigerator, it goes into your oven, it goes into your car, it goes into all of the personal devices we're using. So the demand for chips is like just going up this way. And the largest chip maker in the world was in Taiwan and had if my memory is correct, had a major fire that knocked out production. And then there was another chip factory in Texas that was seriously disabled from the snow and ice storm last winter. And, the chip industry has just been trying to catch up. And it sort of goes to the turning around a battleship. You can say, well, why not just, build another factory, which is what Intel is going to do in Columbus, Ohio. I mean, they've just, committed tremendous resources to build a chip factory in Columbus. But it's going to take 4 or 5 years to build that. So there's a long-term solution. We can build more chip factories, but it's not easy to do that. On the resources, if you're talking about raw material resources, there's a really interesting play, and that play is in China. So as we're going to EVs, right, electric vehicles, Electric vehicles need electric batteries. And there are a couple of elements that are crucial to making electric batteries. And China controls 70% of that market, not just mining it, but also the processing of it. So, there are people in that industry that are predicting that the essential elements that go into lithium-ion batteries that we use for electric vehicles, that's going to be the next oil war, because most of the raw materials, the known supplies right now are in China, and certainly the processing is in China. On other things, Wall Street Journal did an article on Saturday about nickel, another essential item for making electric batteries. There's only one nickel mine in the U.S., and there's absolutely no processing left in the U.S. for nickel. It's all done in other countries, and it's not even like all the processes in one country. It might be mined in Canada, and the first part of the process happens in Canada, and then it goes to like Finland or something. So it's those kind of things, particularly around raw materials, are going to be an issue.
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting. I know in New Hampshire that it's cheaper to cut a tree here, send it up to Canada for processing, and then bring it back as a finished product.
Yeah.
So it's raw materials definitely play a role in all of this.
Right.
Someone here has an interesting thought that I'd like your insights on. Is there any thought that 3D printing close to where purchases are made in order to reduce the need for complex supply chains? Any thoughts around that? I mean, we've seen houses now being built using giant 3D printers. Is that a reasonable thing to think might be helpful?
Yeah, so I actually know a little bit about this one as opposed to ocean transport. So here's the problem with 3D printing right now, and it gets better every year. So 3D printing is exciting. Interestingly enough, like I do a supply chain technology conference every fall. And when I go to my advisory board, 3D printing is always at the bottom of the list of things they're interested in. There's an economic viability. So right now, 3D printing is not economically viable for mass production. You're still going to do injection molding for most parts, but it's getting better every year. The technology is getting cheaper, it's getting faster, it's getting better. Where it's used right now is, as an example, like Boeing makes a jet, right? A jet's a very complex piece of machinery, and Boeing maybe makes 100 jets a year. They don't make 1 million jets a year like the automakers. And there are some parts on the jet that they only need 1 or 2 of that part on the jet. So they need 200 a year. The minimum order is like 1,500. So when they place a minimum order, they get like 7 years worth of parts. So they're doing 3D printing for those parts that are used in small demand that they don't want to warehouse. They are now using 3D printing for a lot of spare parts. If you buy if you've got a 40-year-old GM, they probably somebody still makes the part, but those cars are going off the road. Well, if you have the design, you can make it digital, and you can ship the digital design to a 3D printer and print those parts on demand. So things that are of low quantity, but that they want to offer, are becoming 3D printed. The other thing that 3D printing allows you to do, the questioner asked about complex supply chains. So it's not so much complex supply chains, but you can 3D print as one part complex designs that if you were doing it another way, you might have to screw several things together, right? Or glue several things together. 3D printing allows you to manufacture in one piece some complex things that you couldn't otherwise put together as one piece. So I think it's a very exciting technology. It's getting better, but it's still very much a niche.
Okay, great. So you talked a little bit about outsourcing to China and other countries as well. We've got a question here. They'd like to know, can you talk a little bit more about the impact that outsourcing has had on supply chains? Does shortening or lengthening supply chains make a difference in what we're talking about?
Well, obviously right now, supply chain managers are rethinking long supply chains, right? But they've been operating long supply chains pretty successfully, for going back to about 30 years. Even when they are rethinking China, they're not rethinking China and therefore I'm going to go to Indianapolis. What they're rethinking is China, am I going to go to Vietnam? Am I going to go to Malaysia? They're starting to, look in Africa, which has been kind of untapped. Still looking, at Mexico, looking at, depends on the product, looking at the Caribbean, looking at India. There's still a wage differential. And that wage differential, we're still doing, what's called wage arbitrage in the industry. Transportation was just incredibly reliable before COVID that allowed you to do that. Higher fuel prices, and we don't know if those are going to stick, but higher fuel prices and the uncertainty of the pandemic, the uncertainty around tariffs, is causing people to rethink, would it be better to shorten those supply chains? And so there is rethinking. You just can't do that overnight because I'll give you an example. In 2020, I'm a big fan of the Saturday Wall Street Journal, and there was like the longest article I've ever read in the Wall Street Journal with the CEO of Emerson Corporation out of St. Louis. And he contacted President Trump because he was having problems getting things out of Mexico because of COVID. And in the article, he says, Trump said to him, I've got a solution for you. Just move your manufacturing back to, the US. And his response was, that'll be a big help in 6 years, but I got a plant to run today. So you just have this time factor that you can't easily just build a factory. Think of, you're going to go into Bedford, Massachusetts and put up a factory and what kind of a fight you're going to have over, not in my backyard and zoning and whatever. And then you get through all of that and, it takes forever to get it built. But then do you have the ecosystem that used to exist? If you're in the shoe industry and you go to China, there's a town that does nothing but make shoelaces. And next to it is a town that does nothing but make the heels for shoes. And next to that is a town that makes nothing but soles. If you wanted to bring back shoe production to the US, all of those component manufacturers are gone. So, you're either going to import everything you need to make a shoe, which really didn't shorten your supply chain, or it's going to take years for you to invest in and develop your suppliers. And that's the challenge we face right now.
Well, certainly no easy answers tonight. Right. So we've got another interesting technological solution, perhaps, that's come in. Is there a role for the blockchain to help solve some of these issues?
So, that's the $60,000 question that every supply chain manager is asking. 3D printing is always at the bottom of the list of things my supply chain managers want to hear about. Blockchain is the second from the bottom. So blockchain right now has, if you don't know what blockchain is, it's a string of data that can't be changed. And so one of the things that folks say is that blockchain is really great in a supply chain where you don't trust your partners because they can't go in and mess with the data. But where it's being used right now is in highly regulated industries. So if you think of, the commercial aircraft industry, where you've got to document, if you repair a part, you've got to document everything you did to that part and every tool that was used to do that part and who did it and when they did it and what you did with the part that you told off. And all those things, have to be recorded. It's incredibly important. And so if you use blockchain, you've got this record, and it's a record that can't be changed. Some companies are using it. Companies that have product that is easily counterfeited, like Nike shoes, for instance. And I can't remember if it's Nike or Adidas that's doing this, but they're using blockchain to track their shoes. And therefore, if a shoe enters the supply chain that is a counterfeit, they'll know it. Or if one of their shoes leaves the supply chain, they'll know it. Walmart is using it around fresh foods, including fish, where they're documenting every one of the handoffs of that fish from the boat, all the way to a Walmart store. So there are niche applications right now, but it's still a pretty esoteric technology. And in supply chain, I think it's finding uses in financial services, but in supply chain, blockchain has been slow to take off.
Okay. Speaking of more technology questions,
Sure.
we hear a lot about, driverless trucks, about little robots that are running around warehouses, picking items up and moving them all over the place. So is automation coming soon, and has the pandemic accelerated the demand for it?
Those are great questions and very timely. Let me take the one that really excites me, which is autonomous trucking. Last week I was in Las Vegas at a technology conference, and at the back of the exhibition hall, they had a dozen suppliers of autonomous trucks. And it was like, when you were a kid in elementary school and you went to the fire station on your field trip and you saw the big gleaming fire trucks. So they had all these, gleaming semis that could operate autonomously there. It was very cool. And I did a bunch of interviews with folks. So I sat in on a presentation by Daimler and 3 autonomous truck technology providers. And I also had, at my conference, I had Waymo, which is the Google autonomous vehicle company. And I'm pretty high on autonomous trucking. So the question is when. There are things going on now with autonomous trucks, but the things that are going on now, they still have a driver behind the wheel, in case something goes wrong. And then the next step is to put a driver in the passenger seat, but is there for a sort of, Jesus take the wheel if something goes wrong. And they have a pilot vehicle behind the truck in case something goes wrong. And the way, somebody was asked that question about, so when are we going to see autonomous trucking at the conference I was at? And the guy from Waymo said, I think in 3 to 5 years, we're going to be making more progress, but we're still going to be asked, when are we going to have autonomous trucks? There are things going on, like Walmart in Bentonville is using an autonomous truck. The driver is in the truck, but his hands are not on the wheel, to make deliveries from a Walmart supercenter to Walmart stores in Bentonville. And Loblaws, a Canadian grocer, is using autonomous trucks to make deliveries from a distribution center to its stores. They're doing the same route over and over and over again. They're not like just getting out on the highway. And in the Sun Belt, particularly in Texas, Waymo is operating with one of the big trucking companies. Has been running pilot programs to do. They can do it on a state highway. They can't do it on a federal highway. But no, I think it's very exciting. But you're looking at probably 10 years before you start seeing trucks without drivers. Robots are here today in warehouses and distribution centers, particularly around e-fulfillment. So the most common robot is called an autonomous mobile robot. It's basically a platform that'll hold a tote. And the traditional way to pick items in a warehouse is somebody pushes a cart and the cart's got a bunch of totes on it through the warehouse and picks to the totes. When the totes are all full, they take them and induct them on a conveyor. With an autonomous mobile robot, the cart is on the robot. The person just kind of stands around in the pick zone. The person doesn't have to move very long. And the robot moves to the place where the item to be picked is stored. And the warehouse worker walks over to that, storage location, takes out the number of items they're supposed to pick. They scan them on a scanner that's on the robot, and then they drop it on a tote. And then the robot either goes to the next pick location, or when the robot's done, takes the tote to a conveyor. It's inducted on the conveyor and it goes to packing. We're seeing a lot of those. DHL has over 2,000 of those in use right now. A lot of momentum around autonomous mobile robots. Piece picking robots, to have the robot to do the piece picking, there is some of that. It's much more complex, and so the adoption has been much slower, but it is coming.
Yeah, I don't know if you've spent any time in downtown Manchester recently over the past couple of years, but FedEx is testing their autonomous delivery robot. So you'll see that running around every once in a while. All right, I think we've got time for two more questions I want to fit in here. So speaking of warehouses, perfect timing. We know that warehouse space makes money by turning product over. How do we re-envision this industry to allow it to remain profitable?
Well, warehouses, that's a great question. The purpose of warehouses has dramatically changed because of e-commerce. So a warehouse, when I first started writing about warehouses, was a place to store stuff, and ship out pallets and cartons. Increasingly, a warehouse is, the way I explained it is, marketing is the promise maker, the warehouse is the promise keeper. So warehouses have really taken on an important role. Before, sort of like supply chain, nobody wanted to know about a warehouse unless something went wrong, and then it was the warehouse's fault. Warehouses are automating like crazy. They were automating like crazy before the pandemic. They're going to be automating like crazy now, because as wages are going up, when Amazon's paying 18 or 20 bucks an hour for warehouse workers, plus paying their college tuition and medical and 401k and things, you just can't afford to keep adding. Even if you could get them, you can't afford to just keep adding worker after worker after worker. So automation is going to be one of those things that keeps it, that keeps it profitable. Stuff turns over very quickly now, also because of e-commerce. I mean, warehouses are replenishing all the time. The other thing that's changing is what we think of as a warehouse, where, for years it's been what we call a hub and spoke model of a whole bunch of 500,000 square foot warehouses. Companies, a couple of major warehouses, but they're building lots of little warehouses, 10,000 square feet, 50,000 square feet, near major metropolitan areas, so that they can get in and do, next day or even same day delivery. Warehousing is, believe it or not, kind of exciting right now.
Well, I don't know how many people expected to hear that tonight. Yeah. So I wanted to finish up with this question. What do you think the most important persistent problem we are likely to face with global supply chains post-pandemic?
Labor.
Well, that was easy enough, I guess.
It's the number supply chain officer I talked to.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, I see we are just about at our hour. So I want to thank you, Bob, for joining us here tonight, providing some really great insights. We had a lot of amazing questions come in and a lot of great participation. So thank you so much for your time and your insights. I want to thank also our audience here tonight. We really appreciate all the questions that you did send in. And we hope that you'll join us for our next event, which is going to be on February 14th. We will be talking about the crisis in Ukraine with Russia massing troops on the border and trying to push NATO in certain directions. So we hope that you'll join us for that, as well as our future Global Tipping Point Series events. Our next one is going to be on March 15th. That will focus on the idea of nearshoring, reshoring, some solutions to the challenges that we see here tonight. So thank you all for joining. Thank you all for watching. We hope you have a wonderful evening, and we will see you the next time. Good night.